Welcome back to the Concacast with John Arnold. I'm John Arnold. Yes, we're back. Apologies for the break. Thanks for letting me take a little bit of time traveling for work, traveling for pleasure, and I'm back home and ready to have a great episode of the Concacast. Today's show will have 3 segments. First, the big story, the CONCACAF Champions Cup quarterfinals. Next, we'll have the interview with Cesar Hernandez from ESPN FC talking about the Mexico national team and their triumph at the CONCACAF Nations League. And finally, we'll close out with the importance of a good manager, talking a little bit about Gold Cup qualification. First, as I mentioned, it's the big story in the CONCACAF Champions League quarterfinals, and for me, the biggest story, as I wrote in the newsletter this week, is familiarity. Yes, the CONCACAF Champions Cup exists, like many continental championships, to pit teams from various countries and leagues together and see which team is the best, but we often use it as a prism. Which league is the best? Which country has the best club soccer? The answer in the CONCACAF region for many years has been definitively Mexico. And it may still be this year. There may still be a Mexican team that wins the tournament. In fact, I would actually put my money on that, although there's many MLS teams still remaining, including Lionel Messi's Inter Miami, which heads to LAFC tonight in the CONCACAF Champions Cup match. That is an interesting one. But I think that the 2 intra-league series, the MLS versus Liga MX series, lost a little bit of luster because of the teams involved. The LA Galaxy, we don't believe, have a great chance against Tigres because the LA Galaxy have not been able to win an MLS game so far. They've lost in the away leg to Herediano. And in the other series, Vancouver Whitecaps, Pumas, the Whitecaps, maybe one of the most overlooked MLS teams, at least from my neck of the woods. It is so geographically far to Vancouver. They haven't been one of the best teams in the league, and Pumas haven't been one of the best teams in the league either, although former Vancouver Whitecaps midfielder Efrain Juarez showing up as the manager has definitely lit a fire under the team to beat León 2-1 in that most recent match that Pumas have had. Juarez definitely has the team looking different. He's an intense figure, someone who cares deeply about Pumas as a product of their academy. So there is intrigue in that series, but maybe not as much as there would be in a series like Inter Miami against Club America. Although, of course, that could be the final. But what I'm looking at and what I'm talking about when I look at the familiarity is how these first legs will lead into the second leg. If there will be incidents in the first leg, which there certainly could be in a rivalry series like Cruz Azul Club America, that have all that history with the semifinal and the most recent tournament, the final 2 tournaments ago, and just a long history of playing each other and having incidents since the 1960s when they started playing. I think that you could see incidents in the first leg that lead to intensity in the second leg. Obviously, the stakes are raised in the second and deciding legs. I don't want to fast forward necessarily to the next 90 minutes, but I definitely think that the drama in these ties, partly because of the fact that the matchups aren't as sexy as they could have been, as we thought maybe we'd get an Inter Miami Monterrey, I think you lose some of that momentum, lose some of that drama, but it still could be a tournament that produces those kind of matchups. Who knows? Maybe the Galaxy are able to roll through and we're looking at a Galaxy Cruz Azul, a Galaxy America. And of course, on the other side, we're still very much on track for an Inter Miami Pumas. Messi could visit Mexico City, or another very long trip if the Vancouver Whitecaps keep playing spoiler. And then who knows what we could be looking at in the final. But again, to me, the big story is that familiarity. Could it lead to some interesting dynamics for the neutral viewer, which at this stage of a continental competition is most of us, right? Most of us, I think, watching, chatting in this forum are not fans of any of the 8 teams remaining. So you want to have as much drama for the neutral as possible. That's true whether it's the UEFA Champions League, the Club World Cup, the CONCACAF Champions League, or Copa Libertadores. That's the big story for this week. The big story from the month of March, at least when it comes to men's national teams, was Mexico lifting the CONCACAF Nations League trophy for the first time in the history of that competition. To break it all down, I asked Cesar Hernandez, my friend from ESPN FC, to join me in today's interview. We're now joined by Cesar Hernandez from ESPN FC, the Mexican soccer show, and my friend. Cesar, how you doing, man? Good to see you.
Hey, nice seeing you, John. Nice chatting. Glad to be finally here on the pod and chatting with you, man.
What do you mean finally? It's like week 5.
I know. Well, how come I wasn't on week 1 through 4?
There were great guests in previous episodes, as people I'm sure either watched or can go in the archives and check out. Cesar, you were at the Nations League Final Four and able to see Mexico lift the trophy as the Nations League champion. The first time Mexico lifted that trophy. They've won the Nations League, they've won the Gold Cup. What does Mexico have to do to be head and shoulders above CONCACAF? Are they already there? Where does you kind of think that Mexico is in the pecking order of the region after winning this trophy that had so far eluded them?
I mean, maybe what they need is another performance by Will Smith to kick things off ahead of the
Wow.
final. Maybe that's what really inspired them. But no, I mean, I think it's an interesting question there about where they are in the pecking order. I think at this moment you can't say that they're head and shoulders above the U.S. or Canada. If anything, I would say they're probably in line with them right now. The latest round of games, yes, it was impressive from Mexico, but at the same time, it's a small sample size. I'm not entirely sure if we can confidently say that they're now far, far superior to the other teams. And I'm really curious to see what we see in the Gold Cup because maybe we could see them distancing themselves even more from those other two. But at the moment, I think they're probably on par with them.
I'm in the same boat as you. I think that if they win the Gold Cup, certainly if they win it convincingly, then it's very difficult to sort of put any, conditionals on it. No, Mexico would clearly be the best team in the region, having won the last two Gold Cups and the Nations League. But as we look toward the Gold Cup, where do you think that tournament sits for El3 in importance right now? When you look, people are saying it's the last official tournament before the World Cup, but at the same time, there will be lots of friendly windows that Javier Aguirre can use to kind of get his mix right. When you look at the Gold Cup, what do you see? How important is it for Mexico?
I think for me, it's solidifying that 4-4-2. If we're thinking about tactically about Mexico, if that's what Aguirre really wants to stick with, it's solidifying that formation, solidifying that best 11, seeing who the best options are off the bench, and also seeing if he really wants to commit to the Jimenez front two. Because I think the easy answer there for him was, hey, my two best attacking players, put them in the starting 11 right next to each other. Doesn't matter, they're both strikers. Is that the best option for both of them there? I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's answering those questions right there for all three. And also, once again, I mean, it's kind of a obvious, easy thing to say, but just maintaining that momentum, maintaining that confidence for all three right now. We all know how difficult it was for them in recent years, and it's even say goes back to a decade, when it comes to the national team. So I think it's really maintaining that confidence, especially ahead of the World Cup.
You say you're not so sure about the Raul Santi kind of
Yeah.
forward pairing. I also have some doubts about it, but when you look at it, it's kind of clear that Raul is the star right now for Mexico. When you
Yeah.
look at what he did with Nations League with two goals in both games, what he did against Honduras in that second leg scoring, but also the way that he was able to link with other attackers, even in that friendly against the United States. What do you think Mexico's attack should look like, needs to look like? In a way, it's sort of funny because Raul's the old guy. You're usually kind of trying to put the old guy out to pasture, but instead it seems like you're almost trying to shoehorn the young guy in. What do you want the attack to look like for Mexico, or what do you think is the best setup for L3?
What I'm thinking about is, let's think about the front two of, let's say, from Atlas back in the day, right? And their successor, the Coca. What I'm thinking about right there is that you had someone like a Quinones who did really well with an out-and-out striker and was a little bit more versatile than, let's say, a Santi Jimenez. At the moment, I think you stick with the Jimenez. I think it's worth continuing that experiment. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Because I think you stick with it for now, but maybe you try Quinones as an option for Raul Jimenez.
I think you stick with it. You almost need to stick with it until Santi has a breakout game, and then maybe you
Yeah.
do something different. But like in a way, I feel like the reason that Aguirre puts Santi Jimenez in the starting lineup is because he was getting a lot of pressure, but at the same time, he's at a huge
Hmm.
club. But until he starts to score regularly important goals for Mexico, I do wonder. I wouldn't start him at the World Cup next year if he doesn't. If you're still looking at his most recent Mexico goal as coming in the 2023 Gold Cup final, but maybe
Yep.
he goes off in the group stage and you don't have that worry. You mentioned Cesar kind of bringing that momentum in, kind of keeping the good vibes going for Mexico after they lift the Nations League trophy. It seems like everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet. Aguirre is joking around in press conferences. What do you attribute the change to? Was it as simple as Aguirre coming in? Is it some guys finding form at the right time? Is it the US, Canada, Panama underperforming? Why do you think the vibes are so different in Mexico?
It's interesting because, people have talked about whether it be true or not, a lack of really clear leaders for this national team. And maybe it was as simple as not only bringing back Aguirre, but I think another really important figure is Rafa Marquez. Let's not forget that this guy was captain for such a long time with El Tri. And not only is this guy, he's not playing on the field anymore, but he's there as on the sideline as a leader and as a coach too. So I think you couple that And I could see why the mentality changes for all 3, especially right now when you look at other teams like, let's say, the US and Canada, who are struggling a little bit, and maybe there's a little bit of opportunity there and there's some momentum there for them thinking, hey, we could be top dogs again in the CONCACAF region. So I think as simple it is just to say, bring back the throwback vibes, bring back the 4-4-2, bring back Aguirre for a third time. I think there's something to be said for that. And also too, when you see the way that Mexico play as well, yes, it isn't a really exciting 4-3-3, possession heavy soccer. Maybe it's also Aguirre looking around saying, you know what? Is this the best Mexico roster we've ever seen? Probably not. So maybe playing with a little bit more, not saying throw, you're sitting and allowing a bunch of pressure in the defensive third, but just realizing the current crop of players right now and being like, hey, stick with that 4-4-2. Don't have to have the ball all the time. Bring back the good vibes with him and Rafa, and maybe that's what's clicking.
Yeah, kind of using the players that you have and not trying to cram them into a system. That's something that's always seems to be a debate between not just Mexico, but any national team.
Yeah.
Do you get a system in and try and plug the players in, or do you look at the players and work your system to that? I think it's really interesting. You mentioned the mentorship maybe of Rafa Marquez. When I think about Edson Alvarez, who I thought had a fantastic Nations League first game playing in the more defensive spot, playing farther back with Cesar Montes out suspended, then kind of stepping back into where we used to see him in the midfield. That was Rafa Marquez, right? That's what he was good at. And so the fact that he's kind of maybe not putting pressure on Edson Alvarez to be him, but says, hey, here are some things that you can do, I think could be quite critical for Edson's future success, which not the best year from him at the club level, but I think good in the national team. And if you kind of get everything rolling along, then maybe you're looking in good shape. Well, you sit in San Diego as we're chatting, Cesar. I wanted to ask before we let you go about San Diego FC, a team that I thought was not going to be very good, a team that just beat LAFC for their first ever home win in San Diego, but also has 2 wins away from home, looks quite strong. What's going on? Is it the great weather? Is it the great food? Why is San Diego FC putting it together so quickly?
It's California burritos that are powering this team.
Well, that was the downfall of Mexico at Copa America. Remember, they were at a little spot not far from your neighborhood, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't think you can call it the burritos.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of the credit has to go down to Mikey Vadas, the manager, to Tyler Heaps, the sporting director. Listen, like from day one, they said that they're going to play the way that they've been playing. They want the ball. They want to build out from the back. And people are looking at the roster, they're looking at the 11, thinking like, oh, could there be some defensive issues there? Are there some worries in that? Is this a little bit too ambitious of a thing? And were there going to be a number of videos that are going to show up on social media regarding, was it like playing out from the back when it goes wrong? And you're going to be seeing a lot of that. But so far it's worked. It's been really fascinating to see unfold, and especially since it's not Chucky Lozano that's the star, it's Anders Dreyer. Dreyer has been, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't know much about him before he showed up to MLS, but he's looking like a possible contender for an MLS MVP. Do I think he'll actually be the MVP at the end of the season? No. Could he be, is he going to be in the running? Possibly, just because he's been so fascinating to see him play. Not only a goal scorer, but a chance creator. I think the star of the last game, the star of the season so far for them, and even when Chucky Lozano hasn't been at 100% due to injuries, I think you still have a leading figure like him that has been able to take charge.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you say, oh, they look good and Chucky hasn't looked good yet, you think he'll eventually get plugged in. Yes. And then you're like, man, maybe they can avoid some of the expansion teams, St. Louis, for instance, that we saw have a great regular season and really sort of nosedive toward the end, collapse in the playoffs. Maybe they can avoid that fate. I'm sure we'll talk again before that happens, Cesar, because you want to come on the show so often. That's Cesar Hernandez from ESPN FC, from the Mexican Soccer Show. You can find him there and at a certain South Park burrito truck as well. Cesar, thanks for coming on, man. Appreciate you joining the Concacast.
Thanks so much, man.
Thanks again to Cesar for joining in the interview. You can find links to his social media in the description of this show. I wanted to close out today talking about Gold Cup qualification and some of the ramifications teams are still feeling after the Gold Cup qualification round, which took place at the same time as the CONCACAF Nations League Final Four. Countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Costa Rica, Jamaica booked their places in the Gold Cup, and some countries that thought they would be in, namely Nicaragua, fell short. Nicaragua has been managed by Marco Antonio Figueroa, Fantasma Figueroa as he's known after his playing career, a Chilean coach who has had mixed results with Nicaragua, but after failing to get to the Gold Cup, took on a somewhat adversarial tone with the local press. At one point, he called a local journalist stupid. Most of the conversation, most of the news conference was carried on in a somewhat normal, especially for Central America, tone, but there was clear dissent from the Nicaraguan press, especially about the allocation of resources. Nicaragua chartered to Guadalupe to try and be at their best to get back directly to Managua, start preparing for the second leg, but they ended up losing both games 1-0, both legs of the Gold Cup qualifying tie 1-0 to Guadalupe. Now, those of us who are Concacaf watchers, probably you watching the Concacast, won't be surprised to see Guadalupe make the Gold Cup. But Nicaragua had big aspirations to get there, and they're still doing okay in World Cup qualification. But seeing Figueroa interact with the local press brought to mind the theme of respect, the theme of a men's national team coach that cares about the country, that cares about the players, that cares about the overall development of soccer in a country, and isn't just there to collect a paycheck. Now, I'm not trying to say that Fantasma Figueroa is just there to take money and go to the bank. In fact, I wouldn't be entirely surprised if he could find a job that allowed him to make more than managing the Nicaragua men's national team. But I do think when you contrast it with someone like Dwight Yorke, a former Trinidad and Tobago player, who, in addition to getting Trinidad and Tobago to the Gold Cup with a convincing victory over Cuba, after the game used his post-game press conference to stump for funding from the private sector, from the government, and talk about how everyone can get on board and try and push the Soccer Warriors to a World Cup, maybe in 2026, to a good performance in the Gold Cup, trying to unite and not divide. Then you see Figueroa. Now, obviously, the results are quite different. A manager after a loss is going to talk differently than a manager after a win. That's just the nature of the game. Even if you can say, oh, well, you need to put the results aside and talk about the performance, it's always going to change based on how a team does. And I think you could also hear me wrong and say domestic coach good for men's national team, foreign coach bad. That's not what I'm saying either. I think there are foreign coaches who have understood how to connect with what's happening in a men's national team, in a fan base, in a federation, better than domestic coaches and vice versa. I mean, in the CONCACAF region, we can look immediately at Jesse Marsch. He seems to be the perfect coach for Canada. He seems so connected with what the Canadian fans feel, with what the national team setup has been, with the history of the federation. It seems like he's the right man for the job, even though he's not Canadian. We see it on the global stage as well. And yet, I do think that what matters is the manager's disposition, the manager's respect for the country that they're taking over, the players that they have. And I do think that as Nicaragua reportedly is negotiating Figueroa's exit, in part, I do think because of the disrespect he showed toward local journalists, and also even toward local players, calling out one of the domestic-based players in the press conference in a strange way, I felt, saying, this is not the best Nicaraguan midfielder out there. Okay, say that behind closed doors, maybe to motivate a player, but no need to bring that into the press conference. Most managers don't go into their positional power rankings in a public forum. I felt that it was probably right to move on from Figueroa at that time, and I do think it's probably because he doesn't fit anymore with what Nicaragua is trying to accomplish, with where they feel that they should be as a soccer nation. Yorke, meanwhile, is going to be wildly popular because he's a popular ex-player, but also because he's shaking the right hand, saying the right things, and getting the results, of course, that are going to allow Trinidad and Tobago fans to dream, have hope, and think that maybe things are going in the right direction. We saw other international managers take care of this during Gold Cup qualification. Miguel Herrera and Costa Rica smashing Belize in both legs. Steve McLaren getting Jamaica to survive a scare in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, get a result there, get a victory, and now start planning for World Cup qualification and eventually the Gold Cup. This is exactly how it should be done, but it is a skill, and it's a skill that I think that those who decide who's leading their national teams forward should consider when they think about who leads them into the next stage. That about do it for the Concacast with John Arnold today. I've been John Arnold. Thanks again for watching, and let's come back next week. Let's make this a weekly thing again. I'll talk to you next week when we break down whatever happens in the first leg of the CONCACAF Champions Cup and look ahead to the Gold Cup draw. Talk to you then.